Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the third in our second series of UNSW From Home. I'm Professor Claire Annesley. I'm Dean of our newly formed Faculty of Arts, Architecture and Design. That's a working title here at the University of New South Wales. I'm delighted to be hosting today's digital conversation where we're going to be exploring the really important topic of what is ecocentrism and can it save us? But before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people that are the traditional custodians of the lands from which I'm speaking today. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we meet on wherever we may be across the country and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So today's conversation is going to address, as I said, ecocentrism, which considers the inherent value in all of nature, shifting our focus and our values from man to planet Earth. It's a way of viewing the world that's both ancient and resurgent. As we struggle with the environmental crisis, political discourse and the worldwide pandemic, we are going to be discussing today whether ecocentrism could be the answer to society's search for harmonic and regenerative solutions for today's most pressing global issues. Like all of these conversations, we hope each time to have audience participation. You will be able to pose questions in the chat function on this webinar, and the questions are going to be moderated, and we will publish and answer as many of these as possible. Also, if you need to leave this webinar early, don't worry, our conversation is being recorded and the link to the recording will be emailed out to everyone who registered for this meeting. So, with that all said, let's now move on to the subject matter for today, and I'm really delighted to introduce you to our panel today. I'm going to start by introducing Tema Milstein, who is an Associate Professor of Environment and Society here at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, and she's also convener of our incredible Masters of Environmental Management programme. Her work tends to ways that culture, society and communication inform and are informed by environmental relations. Tema's a former Fulbright scholar and her research interests span the globe, examining eco-cultural meaning systems, ecotourism, endangered wildlife, environmental activism and eco-culture jamming. Interestingly, her first career before she became an academic was as a print journalist. So Tema, let me say massive welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Where are you joining us from?
Thank you, Claire. I'm joining from campus, UNSW campus, and on the unceded land of the Gadigal and Bedegal people of the Eora Nation. And as a member of our Faculty's Environment and Society group, a core goal of our work is to seek out restorative relations between peoples and country as one way of paying respect to elders of this land and to traditional custodians of all lands and waters, past, present, and emerging.
Fantastic. Tema, thank you and welcome to this conversation this afternoon. I'd also like to welcome Craig Kerslake, who is one of our wonderful alumni, did BA in 1995 and BE in 2006, and is an associate architect with a passionate social advocate for sustainable outcomes and well-being of First Australians. He seeks the realisation of built form with enthusiasm and real spirited innovation. As an Aboriginal architect, Craig draws upon ideas of country and brings this forth into architectural form with real unique expression that finds resonance with all Australians. Craig, welcome to this conversation today. Thanks for joining us. Where are you joining us from today?
I'm in Gamarigal land, which is the northern beaches of Sydney.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for joining us. And our final speaker is the co-founder and creative director of Cultural Capital, Mark McClelland, who graduated with a grad cert with us in 2013. He has 25 years experience in the design, arts and cultural sectors. Mark has become a real authoritative voice in the emerging field of cultural placemaking. His work connects art and infrastructure, people and place, creating meaning within the the urban landscape. And Mark also undertakes projects as a sculptor and a public artist. And in this role, he is a 3-time finalist and former winner of Sydney's prestigious art event, Sculpture by the Sea. So Mark, welcome to you. Yeah, absolutely. Welcome to you as well. Where are you calling us from today?
Thank you, Claire. I'm in Braidwood in southern New South Wales. Braidwood is the sort of northwestern edge of UN country, which is a long, thin strip running down the south coast and the southern tablelands of New South Wales. And I pay my respects to the UN people as the traditional custodians of this country and extend those respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are with us today. Pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging.
Mark, thank you very much, and welcome to this conversation. Right, so should we begin our conversation? I think we should get going. I'm going to kick off with the first question to you, Tema, if that's okay. So this is a conversation about ecocentrism, but what is it? What is ecocentrism, and what's the how does culture tie into this concept of ecocentrism?
Sure, thank you, Claire. We could think of ecocentrism as a worldview, a kind of foundational orientation to the world. We all have worldviews that we carry with us. And before I talk a bit more about what it is, I want to describe what it's not. I think it's useful to contrast it to anthropocentrism. And anthropocentrism is the current globalized dominant worldview. It's about human-centeredness. It's about seeing nature as other. It's a hierarchical view of human relations with a more than human world, with humans on top as most important, as exceptional, and with nature as having only utilitarian value. So that's anthropocentrism. And in contrast, ecocentrism is, as you said, it's not only a current alternative to this dominant anthropocentric view, but it's also an underlying ancient and enduring living worldview that is about understanding reality as an interrelated web of life. And humans are just one interdependent part of that web, that all living and non-living elements of Earth are intrinsically valued, therefore, and not valued for their utility to humans. So where does culture come in here? We can understand culture as our lens on the world. Or as a dynamic social construction that our cultures inform the ways we think and also the ways we behave. Our cultures allow for and encourage certain ways of thinking and acting with or in or as nature, and also constrain certain ways of thinking and acting within or as nature. And so we could, if we bring together culture and worldview, with culture as a lens, we could think of worldviews as a filter on that lens. And so it's through those filtered lenses that we perceive and engage reality. And in that way, there's no neutral way of seeing the world or representing the world. Instead, our cultures and our worldviews are always helping to select and arrange and organize and helping us evaluate our experiences, our knowledges, and our moments in the world. So especially when we're least conscious of them doing so. So even though there's no one worldview in any given culture, there are dominant worldviews. And currently in the westernized and industrialized cultures throughout the world, there is the dominant worldview of anthropocentrism. And the difficulty we face is that a function of culture is that it reinforces the status quo. It reinforces the norm. And so that, and then we're wrapped up in the fact that our dominant culture is interested. So our power, our economic structures have formed within this dominant view and norm, and they benefit from it. And so therefore they're keen to reinforce that status quo. We may mention it later, but I just published a book called The Routledge Handbook of Ecocultural Identity. So after this, if people want to do further reading, there's about 40 chapter authors that look at different cultures around the world and how they're dealing with the tensions that are arising between anthropocentrism and ecocentrism in all these different contexts across disciplines.
Tema, that's really interesting. So is the key to shifting from anthropocentric perspectives to ecocentrist perspectives, shifting our cultures?
Yeah, it's about paradigm shifting, right? And that's going to involve so many things that are interlinked.
Fantastic. Great. What I should have said at the start of this conversation is that we have brought together colleagues from and alumni from the 3 different faculties that are coming together to form the new faculty. So Tema is currently in the Faculty of Arts, Social Sciences, and I'm going to move across to Craig now, who as an architect is somebody who represents the built environment perspective. And what we've been trying to do with these conversations is bring out the 3 perspectives of our 3 different faculties to bear on these really important issues. So Craig, let me turn to you. What I wanted to ask you is whether as an architect you could speak a little bit about the importance of environment, sustainability and culture in the work that you do.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. It's paramount. I mean, if you're an architect and you're not talking about sustainability, you're kind of failing, you know. And how we intertwine culture with that is fascinating. Sometimes I look at the Australian society and I think it's like we're suffering from an affliction of mass narcissism. And as individuals, I kind of think I don't really blame individuals for that. It's like Tema was saying, this is a cultural paradigm, and being an Indigenous architect, I look upon the world differently, probably to most of Australia, and I think that there's some critical things that culture needs to adapt to, especially with the changing landscape that we see with bushfires and pandemics and crazy people like Donald Trump. And understanding ourselves from an Indigenous perspective is what I've always tried to bring into the built environment. And people ask me all the time, well, there's no difference. There's no point of difference actually with architecture. We can't see any tangible changes in what architects design. I think differ on that. I think there's absolutely so many things we can do. And the first thing that I've been doing with my team at PMDL is just talking about how we engage at a cultural level by bringing those stories of country. So engaging with elders and bringing those stories into the built environment. That is fantastic, and it proves to create a built environment that is both cultural in its expression, and it kind of changes the way we think about our spaces and places at a very elementary master planning level, and also about how we are as human beings on that landscape.
So do you think it's a good way to chip away at that narcissism that you...
Yeah, absolutely. We have this kind of affliction because we have evolved that way. You know, there's individualist societies, and they think about, you know, number one, that, you know, we're very independent, we're driven, we're focused on what's good for me. You know, people that use leaf blowers. You ever seen someone with a leaf blower? They're the most amazing things. They blow your problems. They take your problems from your land and they blow it away to someone else.
While using up a whole load of energy.
Yeah. Well, I think, and in the individualist model like America and Australia, the UK, we lack community. And there's a lack of responsibility for other human beings as well as the landscape. And then you look at collectivist cultures like, say, India and Japan and China, Latin American countries. They have a really strong sense of community because they're less about self and more about the core group. But what's missing from that story is the landscape, the natural world. Yeah. So if a Martian were to land on Earth, they'd look upon first Australian cultures and they'd say, hey, they're collectivists, but they've got this crazy idea. They actually think that they belong to the landscape. And when you belong and you have a relationship with something, you naturally come with responsibilities associated with that. And that's the bit that's missing. I think it's about belonging.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
so
very...
I bring that to my architecture anyway.
About belonging. I think that's really fantastic. Thanks, Craig. Mark, I'm going to come to you now, and I wanted to talk to you about your experience as an award winning sculptor and design director. I was wondering if you could elaborate on your work as a cultural placemaker. What does that mean for you?
Yeah, it's interesting listening to Craig talk, because so much of our work connects into and develops around those themes that Craig was talking about. But in my case, what I was trying to do with art, with sculpture, was find ways of helping people to view or experience landscape in a different way, or to pay attention to it. And this connects to Craig's idea of narcissism a little bit, that I always envisage people sort of striding along in their heads, and what I was trying to do with my art was pull them out of their heads and make them feel something. And what I particularly wanted to make them feel was to feel something about the place that they were in, to start the most basic level of conversation between people and place. And I was thinking about it in quite simplistic terms, but that work has evolved into this work that you mentioned as a cultural placemaker. And so what I'm doing there is taking those sort of foundational ideas of trying to make people feel something in place and and then applying them really in a bigger canvas. So we work with architects and urban designers and landscape architects, and so the foundational, the beginning of projects, so we can lay this thinking in very early in the design process. And the idea of making people feel, so artists bring into these collaborations this emotional content. They can invest place, the built environment, with a sense of meaning. And the idea of doing that and making people feel is, in a way, Craig said it so beautiful, it pulls you out of that narcissistic view of the world. It opens you. When you feel, you are open to inputs that you can't receive, you can't accept when you're just in your own head. And again, in my case, what I'm wanting to happen in those moments is for people to feel the place that they're in and start to think about it, start to see it differently, start to build a connection with it, which we're so often divorced from those connections with place in almost every way now. And all I'm trying to do is create a sort of a fibrous, like a light fibre moment of realisation that then people can follow their own path of experience from there. But as artists, we can help them along that path. We can tell story, we can lay story and narrative, place-based story and narrative into this work of urban design and built environment so that it takes on meaning. It's interesting, at the moment we're doing some work in Barangaroo, and the northern end of Barangaroo is beautifully designed and landscape architected, and there's so much about that is absolutely beautifully done, and people love it, and it's a huge asset to Sydney. But there are very few stories there. This will be our job to bring these stories through. So Barangaroo herself is sort of entirely missing, although it carries her name. And that area of Ngawi Cove, that little cove that's been reconstructed, Ngawi was the canoe with which the women went into the harbour to do their fishing. And again, that story is entirely absent. It's by bringing those sorts of stories in, we just change these relationships with people and place.
Fantastic.
Great stories. Yeah.
Craig, is that idea of, you talked a lot about belonging, is that idea of feeling also an important part of your architectural practice?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's that sense of belonging. It kind of takes you out of yourself. It's not about you anymore. It becomes about the story of country. And we talk about country as being the natural world and people. That's belonging to country. And if you get that story told in the architecture or the urban design, you're telling a very authentic story that everyone can relate to. It gets away from that narcissistic model. This is about, capitalism, or this is about the story of some, casino. It's not about that. No, it's about the landscape, and we are part of that. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, that was a great way to kick off this discussion. I think we've already covered a lot of amazing richness there. Before we came live to this meeting, we had asked people who had registered for this conversation or to attend this conversation to submit some questions. So we have some previously submitted audience questions. And what I thought we'd do now is just go through those. So thank you, first of all, to everybody out there who did send through some questions. We're going to go through some of those now, and then we'll go to live questions. So please, if you're watching, do keep some live questions coming in as well. We'll come to those in a minute. So our first question is from a UNSW alumna, Justine. Hi, Justine. She asks, does ecocentrism require the global community to make any sacrifices of the historically prevailing worldview, such as anthropocentrism? We were talking about this before we came on air, how I was going to struggle with pronouncing that word. If so, what are those sacrifices, and what are those costs and opportunities? Now, Temma, this is something that you touched on a little bit in your first remarks. So I was wondering if we could come back to you. So what sacrifices does adopting an ecocentrist view require?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And she said historically prevailing worldviews. And I wanted to just clarify, I mean, this is quite a recent worldview. This is not deeply historical. But I mean, we could argue it has had some short-term benefits, but really only for a very small minority of peoples, and of course a very tiny minority of the planet. And at the same time, it has had enormous cost for the many and for the long term. And anthropocentrism, I mean, we need to understand too, is it's intimately interwoven with other centric mastery exceptional orientations like patriarchy, colonialism, racism, homophobism, we can go on. So the benefits of shifting are enormous because it's all wrapped up together. So a first benefit is life gets to continue on this planet.
Yeah. Small detail.
So let's start with survival. And that's not just for our species, but for many, many others. And then a secondary benefit, there's so many benefits, but a secondary one is that we can experience the belonging again. Many of us can experience the belonging again, and that feeling of conviviality, of being alive, the aliveness of being together, of being generous together, and the cost, if we keep anthropocentrism as the dominant worldview, is that we won't survive. The cost of relinquishing anthropocentrism it means we're shifting from power over orientations to power with orientations. And so those who have benefited from power over will have to relinquish that. And perhaps there's some short-term costs. I think it's mostly going to be economic for the very tiny minority. But also at the same time, there's huge benefits even for those who have benefited for giving up anthropocentrism and moving towards ecocentrism. So they get to give up political relationships that promote narcissism, which is about being insensitive to each other's needs. They get to give up a distorted perception of all of those who are othered within anthropocentrism. They get to also give up a distorted perception of self. And if we think of all the humans who are wrapped up in the worldview of anthropocentrism, that means that we have distorted our understanding. We've limited the possibilities for what it means to be human and for what humans can become. And that distorts our view of ourselves and our treatments of ourselves and our treatments of others as well. So it's quite damaging, anthropocentrism, not just to everyone who is clear victims of it, which is most everyone, but also to those who identify as master.
Fantastic, Temma, thank you. I think that was a really, really excellent and clear answer to Justine's question. I'm going to jump across to another question from an alumna, Catherine. So hi, Catherine. Her question is, as a local councillor in a regional area, what can be done to centre ecological values when so much of our legislation and planning instruments work against it? So I think that's a really good question about how to do it in a really practical sense, how to unpick the rules and regulations that seem to constrain a shift to this view. And Mark, I wonder whether this is a question that I could throw to you for a first answer.
Yeah, certainly, Claire. So many ways to think about this question. I think I might try and take a sort of a practical approach to the answer. I mean, to a large degree, or to an answer, To a large degree, we are seeing at least place values being adopted by government, by state and local government, and frameworks like the Designing with Country framework being developed and adopted and implemented. And you could say that all this is in a fairly early stage of its life. And so some, progressive councils will be grabbing this stuff earlier, and some others will be later to come on the, to sort of get on that train. But place working frameworks themselves, which have really taken off through the local government sector, a place working framework is a profoundly integrative framework for working together. I mean, it's designed to break down the traditional silos that stopped people working together, so that instead of projects being led by traffic engineers, everybody has an input into how a place is developed. And so those inputs should then include ecological values and ecological ways of thinking if they are present in your council organisation at all. And I'd offer this caveat about that currently place working frameworks, they take a very human-centric view, and that raises the sort of eco versus anthro question again. But the way that I have I see the world through an integrative lens. I tend to bring things together rather than push them apart. And the way that I would approach that is to say, if we're at a human-centric way of looking at place at the moment, that the next phase or an integral phase of that has to be an ecological viewpoint, because it's this idea that as people, we're not separate from nature. Culture is a part of nature. For almost all of human history, we've lived like that. It's only really post-industrially that we've separated, the human experience, the cultural experience from the natural experience, and divided those things. And that's that anthro view of the world that's caused so many of our problems. But I've drifted away a little bit from the council framework. But let me bring it back to a practical level for the questioner as well. I go to a conference called ICTC most years, the International Cities, Town Centres and Communities Conference, and they always have fantastic case studies of council projects at a local government level implemented with ecological values at their core. And so I think it's a matter of looking for best practice examples and learning what you can and implementing them in your environment as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, Craig, is there anything that you would add to that from the perspective of an architect?
Yeah, look, I mean, the fact that you're a councillor and you're asking this means that you actually care about it in the first place. And I would say that First Australians, I don't know which council you're in, but find your local elders, sit down with them and say, hey, have a yarn. We call it yarning. And just ask them, what's important to country here? What's the story of country? And by that first initial conversation, you're setting a path of the journey of the design of your thinking in a better direction. It's like Mark said, it's more about place and how we talk about our belonging to that place and how we celebrate that.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I think that's really good. Listening, that's always super important. Okay, I'm going to jump across to another question. I'm going to bring this one to you, Craig. So okay. This is from another of our alum called Peter. Peter says, to what extent does the Western philosophical tradition of Scala Naturae still pervade our worldview? And is there an alternative chain of being model that is not hierarchical? So Craig, I'm going to start with you, but Tema, I'm sure this is a question that and Mark, maybe you could both jump in afterwards as well. Craig.
Look, that's a very hierarchical system that we're talking about. We're talking about a system that sees human beings as the top. Anthropocentrism, we've already started to discuss it. Yeah, there is another model. There is another model, and it is the Aboriginal model. I could say First Australian, but I can't speak for Torres Strait Islanders because I don't really know their specific beliefs. But in Wiradjuri land, and in Sydney, in Darawal and the Yuin Nation, where I was born on the Yuin Nation actually, And we believe that by belonging to country, you are part of it. It's not something you control. With the narcissistic idea, we have this inflated sense of importance. We're above everything. Our God is above. It's a human figure in the sky. The entitlement that we take away with some God-given right to do whatever we want is a huge problem for the environment. I mean, we take no responsibility for other people or the landscape because we're disconnected. So a model that brings us back to belonging and being part of the landscape. We're not above it. I've walked with, elders, excuse me, in the bush, and they'll say something, those people over there. And I'll say, what are you talking about, Uncle? I think he's gone a bit crazy. There's no people over there. And he says, oh, those people over there. And you point to a pile of rocks. And we are the landscape, literally. We come from it and we go back to it. It's something you belong to, so you have a relationship to it. That makes it easier. You don't need isms. You don't need clever people to tell us how to be with the landscape. It's intuitive. Of course, it's like, stabbing your own arm. It's like, why would you have a law to say, thou shalt not stab one's own arm, because it will bloody hurt if you're connected to it. That's that disconnection that's a huge problem. So very interested to hear what Temma and Mark are saying. It's right on the money. Aboriginal culture has so many answers, is what I'm saying. Talk to your elders.
So the concept of culture does the same as that concept of ecocentrism.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Temma, is there?
That's great to hear. And I think, I guess the only thing I'd add is, since the great chain of being, if you could really visualize it, right, it's this kind of hierarchical ladder of, who's on top, and just like Craig was saying, the big God on top in Western culture. But that this was going on, before that time too, is that there are these higher forms and lower forms, and that there was no moving on that ladder. You simply had a rung on that ladder. And so that's cultural, clearly, and it's also very much informing contemporary Westernized and industrialized culture. But so instead, I think another visual way of understanding sort of a ladder is, a web, a net. As Craig was saying, right, or other people over there, those people over there, not others, but those people over there. So kin-centric, interlinked, interrelated, interwoven, and so it really lets go of that. I mean, very rigid and very hierarchical separation that still exists, and as a basis, the premise, actually, of much of our decisions today.
Yeah. Great, fantastic. So listen, I'm seeing in the chat that we've got our live questions coming through as well. So I think that now's probably the time for us to switch across to those. So we have our first live question, and I'm going to throw these out to all of you, if that's okay. So please feel free to jump in whenever. So our first live question is from Prue, and she says, ecocentrism is an attractive model, but being bound by humanness, what is a legitimate model that respects the non-human without losing the sense of ourselves as humans? So who would like to have a first stab at that? Go, Temma.
I mean, I think it's, you don't lose being a human, you actually regain being a human by moving into ecocentrism, right? We kind of let go of a very distorted view of what humanity is, and return to one that is much more multifaceted, much more enjoyable, and I think actually, I think this could be a good time actually to discuss ecocentrism maybe a little bit more, because it's not about letting go of being a human, and deep ecology actually gets to often puts forward that idea of it's kind of a cosmic spiritual kind of letting go of humanness. But that's also quite problematic because you don't do that. That is the form we're in. And it also lacks the important lenses of systemic inequity and power. So it's practically ineffective. So it both puts forth this idea of something we can't ever do and as actually not something that we would want to do. It's nice to enjoy being this in this form, but also it doesn't work. It doesn't paradigm shift. And so a wonderful Australian philosopher, Val Plumwood, put forth a different view of ecocentrism to deep ecologies, and it's instead of this egoless kind of locationless dissolving our humanity, instead it's taking on liberatory models that have been given to us by scholars in anti-racism studies, anti-sexism, anti-colonialism studies that really understand when we look at anthropocentrism, what it is about is power and privilege. It's not about focusing on our humanness. It's about focusing on mastery. And so by using these very well elaborated insights from these different scholarships, what she put forth is this idea that there are certain traits that run through as a thread through all forms of othering, and that recreate this kind of center versus other. So you could see it, with sexism, men as a center, women as the other. With anthropocentrism, it would be, humans as a center, everyone else as the other. And so she looks at these traits like radical exclusion, right, where we see the other as not just separate, radically separate, but also inferior, or homogenization, where we see the other as interchangeable, as just this stereotyped, replaceable other, or also this trait of denial or backgrounding, where the other is represented as not worth noticing, as not essential, or also incorporation. And so as I'm running through these, I think it's easy to hear, oh, that's how racism works. Oh, that's how homophobism works, or that's how colonialism works. So incorporation is a trait where the other is defined only in relation to the center and as lacking the center's, best qualities and therefore disvalued. And then instrumentalism. So the other is reduced to a means to the center's ends instead of given value in its own right, intrinsically valued. So I think that it's useful to get out of the deep ecology view of ecocentrism or anti-anthropocentrism and move into these liberatory models that have been so useful, right, in all of these different isms, centric-oriented isms that have been part of our current reality.
Fantastic, Timma. I think Prue's going to be hopefully happy with that answer. That was a very, very detailed answer to that question. Mark or Craig, is there anything that you would add to that about this idea of how we can do this without losing that sense of humanness? What would your take be on that?
Yeah, I go to where Tamma was at the beginning of her answer, which is that it can only expand our humanness to accept our relationship with nature. I mean, I think as I was saying before, for almost all of human history, we see it most clearly now in indigenous cultures, but for almost all of human history, most cultures have lived in these very close and symbiotic relationships with place, landscape, country. Place has been the provider of the needs of people and communities for almost all of human history. And that brings this symbiotic relationship through which culture develops. But that culture is integrally linked to that place. And it's those linkages between culture and place that bring people a sense of identity that's based in place, that has meaning because it's connected, it's grounded to place, to practice, to community. And I think the word belonging has come up already several times in this conversation, I think from both Craig and Tamma. And people source their sense of belonging from those cultural relationships that were inextricably linked with nature and place. So I can only think of it as an expansive thing rather than a contractive thing.
Great, thanks, Mark. So let me jump across to the next question, which is our next live question, which is from Sasha. So Sasha, thank you for dropping us a question. So Sasha's question, their question is that we're in a very critical planetary moment. we're asked in this moment to expand our sense of identity. How can we expand our sense of identity to this culture and this landscape, to a culture that includes the whole planet? So we're getting really cool questions today. Who would like to kick off with that one? Oh,
I don't want to start off everything, but I just published this book.
Yeah, go for it.
The Handbook of Ecocultural Identity, and so it's all about this question, and it's about 40 authors talking about how can we expand our identities, and I mean I'm not going to talk about everything that's in the book, but it's definitely something I think that we need to think at the identity level. We need to think at all the scales right now, right? We need to think at kind of in terms of human society, right? So like identity levels, community levels, governmental levels, kind of international levels. And I think it's really important to, I like this question. Clearly I'm interested in it because what we have true power over, right, is ourselves. And so how do we ourselves, if we're not already there, how do we paradigm shift? And what are the constraints that are stopping that from happening, right? And since anthropocentrism is a dominant discourse, it's also what's accepted, it's also what's encouraged, it's it's what's kind of fed. It does take some bravery, especially if you're, well, I think I don't want to say especially if you're not Indigenous, but I think that there's maybe less of a clear way forward, perhaps, if you are not Indigenous. And so, but I also think that people are yearning for this. And there's many Indigenous scholars who are really saying, hey, you need to start to listen. You need to start to listen to what we're saying and to what has, while there's so much diversity among Indigenous nations, there is that commonality of belonging to the land throughout them. And so listening to that and getting back, I don't remember who just said it, but that kind of like keep it simple, right? Don't make it too complicated. We don't want to be atomized. We don't feel isolated, and we're feeling that more and more, right? And so, and that's because of this. It's all, again, it's all interwoven. So in terms of how to do it, like a how-to book, I haven't written that yet, but I think that one of the things, I do lots of exercises in my own classes around this, actually, and part of that is to just kind of reach inside and say, what is nature? When I say nature, what do I mean? And then let yourself just stream of consciousness about that and start to see where you go. Because often we'll say, it's the environment, it's out there, it's separate from us, right? Because that's a dominant discourse that we've been taught and given, and it's been reinforced and reproduced, and we reproduce it unknowingly. But it's often when we can then reflect on what are we saying inside ourselves? What are our stories, internal stories that are just keep repeating themselves, and how when we notice them, we might not like those stories so much, and we might then start to think about, okay, what are some different stories I want to be telling or to be part of?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I could jump in there on something that on Jan 26th this year, there was a bunch of my friends and Indigenous people. We all went down to a beach in Manly and decided to do something else. Okay, so what do we do? And so we went down this beach and we got an elder from country, dressed up, feathers and painted up, has a coolerman, smoke coming out, gum leaves. He got us all to go out into the water. Mind you, there's a beach full of people that are drunk and, got Australian flags on all over the place and whatnot. And he got us to go out and float in the water. And when we floated in the water, we took our feet off country, so we weren't connected. And then when we put our feet back on country, we walked up to Professor Dennis Foley, and he smoked us and he welcomed us proper way. And so those beginnings, they sound symbolic, but all bad things go with the smoke. And it's a start that that kind of resets us, reframes our thinking when we do these rituals. And so those rituals, I think, are a great start. Recognizing traditional elders and customs and protocols. And, we're obsessed with animals. My totem animal is the emu. I'm responsible as a custodian for the well-being of emus. I can't eat them. And so just, you don't lose yourself in this. You actually stop being about yourself. And it's like Tana said, you have a conversation about something else that's higher than yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. That's really great. Mark, is there anything with Mark?
Wait, one more thing.
Yeah.
Ceremony, there was people started to come around and go through the smoking ceremony, and more than half the beach, hundreds of people. We had to go and get Uncle Mort gum leaves because he was running out of gum leaves to smoke all these people. And there was people in tears, and they were so moved. And they said, "That was incredible. Why don't we do that?" And it's Australia Day, and we're doing that. So, yeah. Sorry, Mark.
No, not at all. That idea of your feet coming off the ground is just so profound and so elementally simple. Yeah. It's absolutely beautiful, that disconnection and reconnection. But what I'm thinking about this particular question is I'm wondering if the person who's asked this question is thinking, we're facing so many global problems. How do we transcend our own cultural lenses, cultural frameworks, individual senses of identity to address those problems on a global level? And, I wish I could sit here and say I had a clever answer, but of course that's not the case. But what this whole little piece of this conversation has made me wonder is what Indigenous cultures, or how Indigenous cultures would address this issue of global problems. Because the way I'm thinking as I'm sitting here right now is that we haven't really been, we're not used to being at this point of having to transcend our own cultural frameworks, nationhoods, however we want to look at them, and address, yes, we've had the United Nations for half a century or so, but it's still also recent. We're not used to, as people, dealing with these global things, and we're doing a terrible job of it. Something about our national structures that constrain us politically from actually addressing them in any serious way. We all see that. Again, I wonder if Indigenous people who have some interesting, unique, and profound way of connecting with what are global questions.
Craig?
Because look, I'm fascinated by that. A really good friend of mine, Susan Moylan Coombs, an Aboriginal elder down my way, and I should be deeply offended by that. She'll say I'm not that old, Craig, but she's a leader in our community, and one of the things she talks about is like that she's creating a museum for humanity to save humanity against itself. and she talks about gross national happiness and healing. So as a process, yes, Mark, we need to go and talk to the Indigenous people. They've been doing it for so long. They have the elders have been telling me this for so many years, and I just go, that's amazing. Why aren't we doing that? Having an ear for that and having an appreciation, that's another story. Yes, definitely answers. We need to ask them. Listen to them,
So simple again.
I was thinking too of, I'm clearly, from my accent, not originally from here, and I'm from the U.S. Southwest and kind of just above Mesoamerica, and there are many Indigenous stories there that are global in nature, right? And I know there are here too. So just that global lens, even though it's about belonging to place, it can be very localized. It's also very, I think, belonging. There's a global vision there as well. And I was thinking of Tyson Yunkaporta's most recent book, Sand Talk.
Sand Talk. Yeah.
And one of the things he says here and there is, talking about the human species as a custodial species. And there's this moment now where there's a lot of mobility, right? We've all been moving, not everyone, but many have been moving around, especially those with a lot of privilege have been moving around. and also those with the least amount of privilege, right, as in refugee status and migrant status. So that notion of mixing and being custodial in your place, wherever that place may be, I think there's a lot of lessons to learn from that as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So listen, I'm going to move on to the next question. One of the things that we found with these conversations is that we very often get a question which is about advice or tips. We had this when we ran the first series. It was in the middle of lockdown, and we had lots of questions about how do you find happiness in the middle of lockdown? How do you prevent your children from using digital devices too much in the lockdown, and all those kind of things. So we've got a sort of similar kind of question now, which comes from Eden, and they ask, how does one make a move to ecocentrism? So I want to use this as a way of us thinking about, the challenge is huge. It's a global challenge, as we've heard, but what can we do? When we heard the question from our local councillor, there was some really good sort of practical things that we could do. So what would your advice be for people wanting to make a shift as an individual, or in their community, or in their culture? Let's go to some tips. What can we do to be part of that change if we want to be? Where should we start? Temma, I'm not going to start with you. Mark or Craig, would one of you like to jump in?
I can jump in.
Craig, go for it.
Talk forever on this. It's there's so much we can do. That the starting point is always going to point us in a direction that we're going to head. And I think I can only speak for the Australian experience, obviously, but if we really want to reframe our perception of self and move to a place that isn't so narcissistic, it's almost like we need to get all of the elders in country and get them to smoke us all, smoke the whole nation. I mean, we've had a little bit of that with bushfires, an insensitive joke there, but we actually believe that smoking is a cleansing thing, and it actually takes us back to a reframing of ourselves. We need to be thinking about caring and sharing. So how do you get to that? Listening to elders. We need to be welcomed back to country, and to do that, fix the past wrongs. We've got to sort out our really bad relationship with First Australians. It's really bad, and we all want to fix that. And there's ways to do that, and that's economic, and it's truth telling in history. There's so many things that, and then we take on board a way of being that is belonging. I think that everyone in this country can belong to country here. Mm-hmm. I mean, Tyson says that we all are going to, in the future, belong to country, because Aboriginal population is on the increase. There's more kids than there are in non-Indigenous populations. Populations older, and in Aboriginal populations they're younger. So essentially, we are not declining. We are actually a growing race.
I think Craig's you just froze on us, Mark.
So
tiny second there. So thank you, Mark. I'm going to come across to you. What's your tip? How do we make the move to ecocentrism?
I'm just going to sort of jump in with an alternative way of looking, an alternative sort of framework to look at, and that's just about to realize, like, thinking about what is your own temperament and where does that take you in terms of how you want to act. Yeah. So, are you an incrementalist? Who accepts the existing system is anthrocentric, but can find a place to work away within it to make incremental change that eventually reach a point of critical mass and can make big? Or are you an advocate or an activist who wants to push and shove at the system from outside and try to topple it over or turn it inside out or change it? So many of these things, I think, are just about realising what your temperament is and how to best deploy it to bring about the change that you wish for.
Great. And Temma, over to you.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think that, we've been talking about the Indigenous understanding that humans belong to country. And I think another way of saying this, perhaps with a non-Indigenous discourse, is that humans are ecological. It's not, that doesn't capture everything that humans belonging to country means. But one of the things I've been thinking about is that's really important. To get out of anthropocentrism and into ecocentrism, we have to understand ourselves as ecological beings, because we kind of have separated ourselves. We think we're not the environment. And so, Mark, what you were saying about, when I think of ecosystems, everything plays a part, right? Everything's relating to everything else. And so to understand what your skill set is, or what your drive is, your passion is, and then to move from that place, like Mark was saying, and to create that difference, I think is really powerful. And to know that you're never alone, right? That there's so many others with you, right? That are part of the system. And that can be anything from, getting a climate emergency declaration at your local council or at the federal government level, to starting to walk around barefoot and seeing what that feels like, and giving that respect to country, right? And one shift I think that can happen too, and this is from the cultural ecologist David Abram, is moving from the anthro to another place that our human comes from, is humus, which is, and the root of that is soil. It's the same word as soil. It's the same word as also humility. And so he's been talking about, instead of the Anthropocene, it should be the Humilicene. That this is this time of humbleness, and that gives us a direction forward, right? Instead of just saying, "Oh yeah, that's right, we're in charge now." It's this is how it is to be in this era. And he talks about it also being a humiliating time, right? That we're in that moment of humiliation where we need to move through that and then get to that humble state.
I think that's a really powerful thing for us to end this conversation with, that sense of humility, and us to be the need to be humble in this, find that sense of belonging, and feeling that reconnecting with our country and with environment. I think those are all really good tips or ways forward that have come out of this conversation. I mean, we had more questions, and I'm really sorry that we haven't managed to cover them all. It's been a really, really rich and inspiring conversation. I think I've really enjoyed it. I've been fascinated by it, and really grateful that you've given up your time, this lunchtime, to share your thoughts and insights with us. So on behalf of the Faculty of Arts, Architecture and Design, thank you so much, Tema, Craig and Mark, for joining us for this discussion. It was really fascinating. I would like to say thank you as well to everyone who turned out for this live discussion. At a time where COVID-19's dominated all of our lives, I think it's important that we reflect on the other growing crisis in our lives, and that is, of course, the crisis of climate change. And this was a really, as I said, inspiring discussion to help us think about how we can frame that and what we can do to shift the balance within our own lives. So we have one final conversation in our UNSW from Home conversation series, and I hope that you will continue to tune in. Next Tuesday, we'll be addressing the topic of digital humanities, a human-centered approach to the use of technology. You can find details of all our conversation topics and register for those events on the UNSW Alumni and Giving webpage. As I said at the start of today's session, this has been recorded, and we're going to share the recording of this conversation via email with everybody who pre-registered for today's event. And it's also going to be made available on the UNSW Alumni website. You'll also receive a follow-up email, and in that will be a link to a short event survey, and we would really appreciate any feedback you have on this afternoon's conversation. So I really hope you can join us for our fourth and final, for now, UNSW from Home conversation. That's 12 o'clock noon next Tuesday, the 3rd of November. Mark, Craig, Tema, thank you again for joining us. Everybody who's tuned in, thank you, and have a good day.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.